Picture this: you're scrolling through social media, carefully curating the perfect image of yourself. Every post is polished, every photo filtered, every thought presented as enlightened wisdom. But late at night, when the screens go dark and you're alone with your thoughts, something else emerges. The anger you swallowed during that meeting, the envy you felt watching a friend's success, the petty thoughts you'd never dare speak aloud, the desires that contradict everything you claim to believe. This isn't a flaw in your character, it's your shadow. And according to Carl Jung, it might be the most important part of yourself you'll ever meet. Jung once wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." But here's what most people miss. Jung wasn't telling us to eliminate our darkness. He was telling us to know it, to befriend it, and ultimately, to integrate it. Because the very qualities we've spent our lives running from might hold the key to becoming whole. Today, we're going to explore one of the most misunderstood concepts in psychology. We'll discover why your shadow isn't your enemy, why suppressing it makes it more dangerous, and how the parts of yourself you're most ashamed of might actually be your greatest source of power. But first, we need to understand what Jung really meant when he spoke of darkness. The shadow isn't evil, though it can become destructive when ignored. It's not your bad side, though it contains impulses you've learned to judge. The shadow is simply the collection of all the parts of yourself that you've rejected, denied, or hidden away. It's the repository of everything you decided wasn't acceptable, everything you learned to be ashamed of, everything you push down when you're trying to be good. Jung discovered this through his own painful journey. During what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, he encountered aspects of himself that terrified him. He wrote, my soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call, you are you there? I have returned. I am here again. I have shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I have come to you." This wasn't poetic flourish. This was a man desperately trying to reconnect with the parts of himself he had lost in the pursuit of respectability, success, and social acceptance. Jung realized that in becoming a proper Swiss gentleman, a respected psychiatrist, a man of standing in his community, he had amputated essential parts of his soul. But here's where it gets interesting. Jung discovered that the shadow doesn't just contain negative traits, it also holds our unrealized potential, our suppressed creativity, our authentic spontaneity. When we reject parts of ourselves as unacceptable, we often throw away the baby with the bathwater. The aggressive energy we learned to suppress might also be our assertiveness. The selfishness we were taught to be ashamed of might also be our healthy self. The wildness we tamed might also be our passion and creativity. Think about your own life. What qualities do you judge most harshly in others? Jung would say these are likely projections of your own shadow. The things that trigger you most intensely are often mirrors reflecting your own rejected aspects. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, Jung observed. This isn't comfortable to acknowledge, but it's profoundly liberating once you understand it. I remember reading about a woman who was absolutely incensed by people she perceived as arrogant. She would go on lengthy rants about narcissists and she was convinced that humility was the highest virtue. But when she began exploring her shadow, she discovered that she had suppressed her own healthy confidence after being repeatedly told as a child that she was getting too big for her britches. Her rage at arrogance was actually grief over her own lost power. This is the cruel irony of shadow work. The very qualities we've been taught to suppress often contain exactly what we need to become whole. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But why is self-acceptance so terrifying? Because it means acknowledging that we're not the sanitized, perfected version of ourselves that we've been trying to maintain. It means admitting that we're complex, contradictory, and utterly human. The shadow forms early in life through a process Jung called the splitting of the personality. As children, we quickly learn which behaviors earn love and approval and which bring punishment or rejection. The rejected behaviors don't disappear, they go underground, forming the shadow. The approved behaviors become the persona, the mask we wear in public. This process is necessary for survival. A child who expressed every impulse without filter wouldn't survive in any society. But as adults, many of us remain trapped in this childhood dynamic, still desperately trying to be good, according to standards we absorbed decades ago. We've become addicted to approval, terrified of judgment, and we've forgotten that we are allowed to be imperfect. Jung saw this clearly in his patients. He wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life. That I feed the hungry, that I forgive an insult, that I love my enemy in the name of Christ. These are undoubtedly great virtues. What I do unto the least of my brethren, that I do unto Christ. But what if I should discover that the least among them all, the poorest of all the beggars, the most impudent of all the offenders, the very enemy himself, that these are within me, and that I myself stand in need of the alms of my own kindness, that I myself am the enemy who must be loved? What then?" This is perhaps one of Jung's most powerful insights. The work of loving others begins with the work of loving ourselves, including the parts we'd rather pretend don't exist. But this isn't about indulging every impulse or using self-acceptance as an excuse for harmful behavior. It's about bringing consciousness to our unconscious patterns so we can choose how to express them. Let's talk about what happens when we refuse to know our darkness. Jung was clear. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. The shadow that remains unconscious doesn't simply disappear. It leaks out in passive-aggressive behavior, in projection onto others, in sudden explosions of rage or cruelty that seem to come out of nowhere. We see this playing out everywhere in our culture. The politician who campaigns on family values while having affairs, the spiritual teacher who preaches love while being cruel to students, the social media influencer promoting positivity while bullying critics. These aren't examples of hypocrisy, they're examples of what happens when the shadow remains unconscious. Jung observed that the shadow often appears in our dreams as a figure of the same gender as ourselves, usually someone we find threatening or repulsive. But sometimes the shadow appears as someone we're strangely attracted to, someone who seems to live with a freedom we've denied ourselves. Either way, the shadow is trying to get our attention. It's knocking on the door of consciousness, asking to be seen and integrated. But how do we begin this process of integration? Jung's approach was not to eliminate the shadow, but to develop a conscious relationship with it. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. The first step is recognition. We must learn to spot our shadow in action. This requires brutal honesty about our motivations, our reactions, and our behaviors. When you feel triggered by someone, ask yourself, what part of me am I seeing in them? When you have a strong emotional reaction that seems disproportionate to the situation, ask yourself, what old wound is this touching? When you catch yourself being judgmental or self-righteous, ask yourself, what am I trying to prove or avoid?" Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called active imagination, a technique for dialoguing with the unconscious. This might involve visualizing your shadow as a character and having conversations with it. What does it want? What is it trying to tell you? What gifts might it have to offer if you stopped fighting it? I've seen people have profound breakthroughs through this process. A man who had always prided himself on being rational and controlled discovered that his shadow contained a wildly creative artist who had been locked away since childhood. A woman who had built her identity around being helpful and selfless found that her shadow held a fierce warrior who knew how to set boundaries and fight for what mattered. This doesn't mean we act out every shadow impulse. Integration is not about becoming our worst selves, it's about becoming our whole selves. When we know our darkness, we can choose how to express its energy constructively. The rage becomes righteous anger at injustice. The selfishness becomes healthy self-care. The aggression becomes assertiveness in service of what we love. Jung believed that this process of integration was not just personally important, but collectively crucial. He wrote, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. It is not the reality of the hydrogen bomb that we must fear, but what man will do with it." He saw clearly that humanity's shadow, our collective capacity for destruction, cruelty, and unconscious projection, posed an existential threat. This is why shadow work isn't selfish or self-indulgent. When we refuse to know our own darkness, we contribute to the collective shadow. We participate in scapegoating, in the projection of evil onto others, in the dangerous illusion that we are purely good while they are purely evil. Every person who becomes conscious of their shadow contributes to the healing of the collective psyche. But Jung also saw the creative potential in darkness. He wrote, "In the depths of winter, I finally learned that there was in me an invincible summer. The shadow isn't just a repository of rejected negative traits. It's also where we find our unrealized potential, our authentic voice, our creative fire. Many of the qualities we've learned to suppress actually contain the seeds of our greatest gifts. Consider the artist who was taught that creativity was impractical and selfish. Their shadow might hold not just their artistic impulses, but also their courage, their willingness to be different, their capacity for beauty. Or the leader who was raised to be modest and self-effacing. Their shadow might contain not just ambition, but also their vision, their ability to inspire others, their capacity to create change. Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, requires us to reclaim these lost parts of ourselves. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, he wrote. But this becoming is not about adding something new to ourselves. It's about removing the barriers we've constructed against our own wholeness. This process is not easy. Jung called it the most difficult task and warned that it requires courage, persistence, and often the support of others who can help us see our blind spots. The shadow doesn't reveal itself all at once. It emerges gradually, in layers, often through crisis or conflict that forces us to confront aspects of ourselves we'd rather avoid. Many people begin serious shadow work only after what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of depression, crisis, or breakdown that strips away their carefully constructed persona. This can be devastating, but Jung saw it as potentially transformative. The breakdown of the persona is a therapeutic necessity and an opportunity, he observed. I think of a successful businessman who had spent decades building an image of competence and control. When his marriage fell apart and his business failed, he was forced to confront the parts of himself he had suppressed: his vulnerability, his need for connection, his fear of being truly seen. The crisis was excruciating, but it also freed him to become more authentic and ultimately more successful in ways that mattered to him. Jung also recognized that shadow work is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process. The shadow is a living part of the personality and therefore wants to live with it in some form. He wrote, "We don't graduate from having a shadow. We learn to dance with it, to maintain a conscious relationship with it, to honor its energy while choosing how to express it." This ongoing relationship with our darkness is what Jung meant by wholeness. Not perfection, not the elimination of difficult traits, but the integration of all aspects of ourselves into a more complete and authentic way of being. The aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings, of the persona on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other, Jung explained. But perhaps the most radical aspect of Jung's teaching about the shadow is his recognition that our darkness often contains our greatest gifts. The very qualities we've been taught to be ashamed of might be exactly what the world needs from us. The sensitivity we learned to hide might be the source of our empathy. The anger we were taught to suppress might fuel our passion for justice. The wildness we tamed might be the key to our creativity. Jung saw this clearly in his own life. His descent into what he called his creative illness was initially terrifying and disorienting, but it was also the source of his most profound insights and contributions to psychology. He wrote, "My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life." This is the paradox of shadow work. What we most fear in ourselves often contains what we most need to become whole. The parts of ourselves we've spent our lives running from might be trying to run toward us, not to destroy us, but to complete us. Jung also understood that this process of integration changes not just how we see ourselves, but how we see others. When we stop projecting our shadow onto others, we can see them more clearly. When we stop needing to be perfect, we can allow others their imperfections. When we embrace our own darkness, we can meet others in their struggles with compassion rather than judgment. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, Jung wrote. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This transformation happens most powerfully when we bring our whole selves, light and shadow, to our relationships. Intimacy becomes possible, not despite our darkness, but because we've learned to include it consciously. Remember Jung's story of a patient who complained bitterly about her husband's selfishness. Through analysis, she discovered that she had completely suppressed her own healthy interest, leaving her feeling perpetually victimized and resentful. As she began to reclaim her own capacity for appropriate selfishness, her ability to say no, to prioritize her own needs, to set boundaries, her marriage transformed. Her husband's selfishness no longer triggered her because she was no longer projecting her own disowned trait onto him. This is the relational gift of shadow work. When we stop using others as screens for our projections, we can actually see them. When we stop needing them to carry our disowned aspects, we can love them as they are, rather than as we need them to be. Jung's understanding of the shadow also offers a profound perspective on forgiveness. If we truly understand that everyone carries a shadow, that everyone has aspects of themselves they're ashamed of or afraid of, then compassion becomes more natural. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Jung observed, this doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or failing to hold people accountable. It means recognizing the human struggle that underlies even destructive actions. It means seeing the wounded child beneath the angry adult, the fear beneath the aggression, the pain beneath the cruelty. This recognition doesn't eliminate the need for boundaries or consequences, but it does eliminate the luxury of moral superiority. As we near the end of our exploration, it's important to address a common misunderstanding about Jung's concept of knowing your darkness. Some people interpret this as license for indulgence, as permission to act out every impulse without restraint. But this misses the point entirely. Jung wasn't advocating for the expression of the shadow, he was advocating for consciousness of it. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood. Jung wrote, "When we know our darkness, when we understand its energy and its origins, we can choose how to work with it consciously. We can channel aggressive energy into assertiveness, sexual energy into creativity or intimacy, selfish energy into healthy self-care. We become the conscious directors of our own energy rather than its unconscious victims." Jung's final insight about the shadow might be his most profound, that the integration of our darkness is not just a personal achievement, but a contribution to the evolution of consciousness itself. Every person who chooses to face their shadow rather than project it contributes to the healing of the collective human psyche. Every person who learns to love their own darkness creates more space for others to do the same. The upheaval of the world and the upheaval in consciousness is one and the same. Jung wrote near the end of his life, "Everything becomes relative and therefore doubtful, and while man, hesitant and questioning, contemplates a world that is distracted with treaties of peace and pacts of friendship, with democracy and dictatorship, capitalism and socialism, his spirit yearns for an answer to the confusion of opposites, which seem to reflect a cosmic conflict." The answer Jung pointed toward was not the elimination of opposites, but their integration. Not the conquest of darkness by light, but the marriage of both into a more complete understanding of what it means to be human. This is why knowing your darkness is not the end goal, it's the beginning of wisdom. So what does it mean, practically, to know your darkness? It means developing the courage to look honestly at your motivations, your reactions, your judgments. It means asking difficult questions about the parts of yourself you'd rather not acknowledge. It means treating your shadow not as an enemy to be defeated, but as an estranged part of yourself, seeking integration. It means recognizing that the very qualities you judge most harshly in others likely live within you as well. It means understanding that your triggers are your teachers, your projections illuminating your own unconscious landscape. It means accepting that wholeness is not about perfection, but about integration. Not about being good, but about being real. Jung's invitation to know your darkness is ultimately an invitation to freedom from the exhausting project of maintaining a perfect image, freedom from the prison of other people's expectations, freedom from the unconscious patterns that run your life. It's an invitation to become who you truly are, rather than who you think you should be. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, Jung wrote. But perhaps the most liberating thing is to discover that even your darkness has gifts to offer, that even your shadows contain light, that the parts of yourself you've been running from have been trying to run toward you all along. The journey of knowing your darkness is not a destination, but a way of traveling through life with greater consciousness, compassion, and authenticity. It's the difference between being lived by your unconscious patterns and choosing to live consciously. It's the difference between projecting your inner conflicts onto the world and taking responsibility for your own wholeness. In the end, Jung's message is both humble and revolutionary. You are not as good as you think you are, and you are not as bad as you fear you are. You are human, beautifully and terrifyingly human, and your darkness is not a bug in your programming. It's a feature of your wholeness waiting to be discovered, integrated, and transformed into wisdom. This is what Jung meant by knowing your darkness, not to eliminate it, not to indulge it, but to befriend it, to learn from it, and to allow it to teach you what it means to be fully, authentically, courageously human.